We're going to get started with the second half of the long-acting injectables and implantables session. This session will focus on injectables and particulate systems. And the first talk is from Noor Al Rifai, who is a senior scientist in drug product development at Janssen Pharmaceuticals. And we're looking forward to her talk on process development and technology transfer for top-down production of nano and microparticles. She has, in her role, she's delivering on engineering strategies for products, drug products, including creation of process modeling framework and oversight in technology and drug delivery committees. She has a particular subject matter expertise in long-acting injectables, including process control strategies and mechanistic models for process optimization and scale-up. And we look forward to hearing from her on that. Her Ph.D. is in microreaction engineering from UCL. And we welcome Noor Al Rifai to speak. Noor, the floor is yours. We're going to use the video playback, and after that, we'll take questions. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Noor Al Rifai, and I'm very glad to be here today to talk to you and share my perspectives on an area that I've been spending quite some time working on for the past few years. So just a bit about myself and my department. So I work at Janssen R&D within drug product development. And a large part of what we do is into the development of a drug product from the time that we declare NME to the time that we launch. My particular expertise is in chemical and process engineering, which I've practiced within the past 10 years at various companies, and within Janssen for the past 2.5 years, with a special focus on enabling technologies, and nanodispersions is one of those. So today I'm going to talk about various aspects to do with process development and tech transfer for suspension-based long-acting injectables, and I'm going to focus more on top-down processing techniques. So quick outline of my presentation today. I'm going to give an overview of the different technologies that are available to both micronize and nanosize. I'm going to talk about the interdependence of the process, the material attributes, and the resulting product quality in the context of long-acting injectables. Models can be quite powerful, whether they're statistical or mechanistic, and the literature is quite rich in models that can be used for top-down comminutions. So I'm going to filter this down to some practical tools that provide process understanding and help with the upscaling. And my final topic will address characterization of particle size via inline methods, both in development and the production environment. And I'll finish off with 3 different control strategies that can be used for a top-down comminution process. So for suspension-based long-acting injectables, there's evidence suggesting that drug release can be modulated by altering the particle size distribution of the drug. And this isn't a new concept. It's been utilized for decades for oral administration. It largely goes down to changes in the surface area to volume as you change the particle size, and this impacts the overall dissolution rate. It therefore becomes clear the importance of having precise control over this particle size distribution and to have the required tools to produce and accurately measure it. And to manufacture these nano or micro suspensions, one of the ways is top-down comminution, where we start with bulk API manufactured via coarse crystallization, and this is then broken down into smaller units by the application of intense mechanical energy. If the resulting suspension is in the nanoscale, they are known to be thermodynamically less stable and therefore have the tendency to agglomerate or recrystallize. Therefore, during the formulation of these suspensions, additives are added to provide electrostatic or steric stabilization. And this isn't just to retain the particle size throughout the product shelf life, but also to retain it during processing. You often get competition between the particle growth and the comminution. And if you have a very bad formulation, you can even get particle size increasing with time during a milling process as a product starts to aggregate. If we now take a look at the marketed nanocrystal products, it's clear that wet bead milling is one of the most commonly used methods to manufacture nanocrystals. And this isn't a comprehensive list or an updated one, it's from 2016 and also contains products that aren't injectables or suspensions, but it gives an idea of the technologies that have the capability in order to nanosize. And there are a number of other processes that, at least from a technical point of view, can also produce nanocrystals. We saw examples of wet bead milling, which is under the media milling category over here. And another technology that's covered to some extent in the literature is high pressure homogenization. And one variation of high pressure homogenization is microfluidization. So this technology relies on a jet stream that splits and then recombined in a microscale channel. And this generates very high pressures of over 1500 bars and therefore causes particle breakage by a combination of cavitation, shear, and impact. Piston gap homogenizers also operate on the same principle, and they create the high pressures by using a plunger in order to force a suspension through a small gap. Back again to the overview of the different technologies. In contrast to the top-down techniques, bottom-up methods generate nanoparticles by building them from drug molecules. And from an industrial viewpoint, bottom-up methods aren't yet widely used because currently they present us with quite a few challenges that still require fundamental research in order to resolve. One of these challenges is the need for organic solvents. As we're dealing with injectables here, there are very stringent requirements on the presence of residual solvent levels. And this means that after generation of the nanoparticles, there needs to be a very precise solvent switching step to convert the medium to water. Another challenge is terminating the particle growth after generation of the solid phase and preventing further flux to the generated nanocrystal surfaces. This isn't to mention other issues like lack of real-time monitoring tools that are needed to control such a process. And I'm going to talk more about this later on and how there's innovation happening in different areas to resolve all of these issues. But currently us within Janssen and in collaboration with other universities and industrial centers, we're looking into developing industrially viable methods for bottom-up nanosuspension production. And this is under the Long Act Now project. So it's a project that kicked off earlier this year, and it is Marie Curie sponsored, where we have 5 PhDs who are looking into anti-solvent precipitation, supercritical anti-solvent assisted spray drying, as well as other factors such as solvent switching using membranes and looking into the nano suspension stability. So this is a project that will run for about 3 years, and it will be nice to see where this takes us in terms of improving our current understanding and development of bottom-up methods. So I mentioned that I work in small molecule pharmaceutical development, and our work is very much end-to-end, from NME declaration to product launch. And there's an incredible degree of complexity that goes into that. Part of this is to do with defining a manufacturing process, ensuring that we have a robust way to make a batch, and in the early development stages, be able to carry out formulation screening using only milligrams of API. From a processing point of view, and as a process engineer, I'm interested in ensuring representativeness to the commercial manufacturing process at all development phases. In some cases, this would conflict with other priorities, like having high throughput capabilities and using very small amounts of material. What it really goes down to is ensuring the clinical material are manufactured according to a similar processing methodology as our commercial line production, and that the pilot scale processes are scalable and representative. It's also important to assess the suspension for multiple quality attributes other than what is commonly assessed. So every compound is different and could experience different milling-induced surface property changes as well as solid state changes. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next section as well. Like most pharmaceutical processes, there's a very high interdependence between the material and formulation attributes, the process parameters, and the product quality for a suspension-based long-acting injectable. Some of the inherent particle properties that would influence the millability of a material are listed over here, and it's covered to a certain extent in the literature on how these parameters influence the millability of the material. I'm going to give an example on Young's modulus in particular and how this impacts the overall process. So the Young's modulus is a parameter that dictates whether a material is likely to break rather than to deform. To give you a real-life example, materials with a low Young's modulus are materials like foams and rubbers, where if subjected to the force, they will deform elastically and return to their original states once this force is removed. Ceramics, on the other hand, have a high Young's modulus and are therefore brittle and more likely to break on impact. So the effect of this parameter on the milling behavior has been studied quite extensively for inorganic material, and a direct correlation was found between the Young's modulus of a material and the minimal crystallite size achieved with its milling. This is measured using XRD. This means that the material with a higher Young's modulus are more prone to breakage on a crystallite level and therefore have a lower grinding limit. This has been confirmed for inorganic material by several papers. This is another example of tin oxide from a different study. And the crystallite size was found to decrease with increasing specific energy with a final value of around 9 nanometers. On the other hand, for organic material, the literature is quite scarce, but shows quite a different trend in that the initial crystallite size goes through the milling unchanged and it determines the grinding limit. So for this type of material, you can predict upfront what your real grinding limit is going to be and how small you can nano size. The distinction that I've made here between organic and inorganic is based on quite a limited data set and needs to be verified with further studies. It's certainly an area which would be of high interest to get a better grasp on. I'm going to shift my focus now from material attributes to the processing. And one of the important parameters related to the processing in a top-down comminution is the mode of operation. So I'm going to give you an example of how this may work. Milling in one passage at low throughput will give you quite a broad residence time distribution. And this is characteristic of continuous dead tank reactors, where dead zones and bypassing are two factors that contribute to this non-ideality. This broad RTD would then translate into an equally broad particle size distribution, and this isn't good for the product quality. So there are three other options for the mode of operation. You can either operate in cascade mode, and that's by having several mills in series. And by increasing the number of passes, we narrow down the RTD. But this would be quite a costly option. The alternative with a similar outcome is pendulum operation. And this is if you have two mixers either side of the grinding chamber and you alternate through the mill between the two mixers. The third and least costly option that's also practically more easier to implement is operating in circular mode, which is shown in this diagram. But here the residence time distribution from the mill is superimposed over the residence time distribution in the mixing tank. And so the overall particle size distribution is wider than what you would get from a cascade or a pendulum operation. Other than the mode of operation, processing parameters are of course extremely important, and there are significant as well as less significant ones. Processing conditions could also influence the grinding limit that we spoke about earlier from a materials perspective. And it does this by changing the intensity of the impacts. The material I'm showing here on the slide is relatively hard on the pharma scale of compounds. And so you can see that even with the most aggressive milling condition, it wasn't possible to access the submicron range and produce a nano suspension. So the processing can also limit how small you can nanosize. In a similar way, the formulation can impact the apparent grinding limit. It's common to have a optima in the stabilizer concentration, where at low concentrations there's insufficient stabilizer to cover all the particles. And at the high concentrations, the viscosity increases too much that you get dampening of the grinding media collisions. And this is why it's necessary to optimize the formulation prior to any process optimization efforts. So far, I've been focusing quite heavily on particle size as the main quality attribute, but during development, we often follow up other properties, especially ones that could be induced or changed by milling. So crystal fracture is more likely to occur on the weakest attachment energy planes, and those are known to be the most hydrophobic. This is a bad combination because by milling, you can expose more hydrophobic surfaces and therefore negatively influence the solution behavior. An example shown here is for paracetamol, where upon milling, you expose surfaces with higher water contact angles. And so the milled paracetamol would be expected to have lower solubility than the original material. This is a review of literature papers that have produced nanosuspensions via the top-down methods using different types of technologies. And they have showed that nanosizing resulted not just in reduced crystallinity, but also in the creation of amorphous and surface amorphous material in some cases. And this could negatively impact the physical and chemical stability of the API. So my next topic is going to be on process modeling, and I'm going to focus quite a bit on the stress model. It's very commonly used to express behavior for stirred media mills. On the spectrum of possibilities of different types of models, there are data-driven statistical models that rely heavily on inputs from experimentation. They have no mechanistic basis, they are product and geometry specific, and so would only be able to cover a very narrow design space. From a QBD perspective, we would like to move away from defining equipment-specific parameters, such as agitator speeds, bead sizes, and move towards equipment and scale agnostic process performance parameters, such as stress energies and stress numbers, which can be translated back into process parameters when needed. This paradigm shift is to demonstrate that we understand the process, and it would make product transfers between different plants and equipment a lot easier. On the other end of the spectrum are computational fluid dynamics models that would provide more thorough insight into the velocities and occupancies within the equipment. And my focus in this section will be on progress and not perfection. And this is afforded most of the time by the stress model and the first order breakage model. For some things, even rules of thumb are sufficient, and I'm going to show some examples there as well of how this could work. As stirred media milling is currently the more common technology for top-down comminution, I'm going to focus more on the application of the models to it. So a stirred media mill is equipped with an agitator, and it's filled with grinding beads. The suspension is then recirculated or cascaded a number of times in order to achieve the desired particle size. There will be a distribution in the velocities and occupancies of the grinding media within the chamber as a result of the flow dynamics and the energy dissipations. You can simplify this notion, however, by dividing the milling chamber into 4 different parts, where close to the impeller tip exists a relatively small volume that occupies around 10% of the total volume, but also has the highest energy density. around 90% of the total energy density or of the maximum energy density. The large majority of the other volumes are occupied by significantly smaller stress energies. In particular, V4 over here has the lowest occupancy of grinding media due to the centrifugal forces that would push out the media onto the walls of the chamber. So building on this theory, we can then estimate the mean stress energy by doing a weighted correction of the maximum stress energy, which is derived from a tip speed, as well as an effective specific energy. And this is based on a power measurement outputted from the mill and corrected with a mill efficiency factor. I'm not going to go into more depth on these two parameters or the intricacies, detailing how you would arrive at the final calculation. It's well covered in the literature, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on it, either in the discussions today or offline. But my point here is, if let's say you have 3 different chamber sizes and they have different grinding rates because of the scale effect, then you can normalize for the scale effects by keeping the mean stress energy as well as the effective specific energy constant, and you would obtain a single correlation that is scale independent between particle size and the specific energy input. There are some challenges associated with applying this particular approach of the stress model, and I'll show later on variations of it that are easier to apply. And it's mostly to do with obtaining a reliable power measurement to feed into this equation. Often, the measured power will start off high as you have coarse material, and during the milling, this is going to reduce down to very low values, or in some cases, even below the idle power of a dry mill. There are various reasons why it goes below, and it's mostly to do with the reliability of the measurement itself. But in general, any theories that rely on power measurements are designed to work for hard and inorganic material like limestone or silica. That's not to say that it won't work for all organic material, but certainly it's been a challenge in a lot of the cases that I've seen. So variations of this model have been successfully applied for other geometries. In this particular study, the objective was to bridge between the small-scale equipment outputting only 10 grams of API and the larger equipment that produces about a kilo. And looking at just the mean stress energy parameter and translating the learnings from the stress model theory into rotostato pin disks this time, it was found that by keeping constant the cumulative stress energy of the rotating pins, that's based on their tip speed, resulted in similar particle sizes for the 3 different equipment studied. I'm now going to talk about brittle material and their breakage behavior, as they exhibit some special type of behavior. In general, there are 2 different types of impacts. The first is frontal impacts of 2 grinding beads, and the probability of this type of stress is proportional to the grinding media diameter. The other type of impacts are shear stresses, and this happens as a result of shear between the grinding media surfaces. The probability of a shear stress happening is linked to the surface area of the grinding medium. Now, frontal impacts are known to have the highest energy and are therefore responsible for the majority of the breakage, whereas for agglomerates and brittle particles, shear stresses are sufficient. So for those brittle particles, low values of stress energy are sufficient, and once a threshold is reached, the breakage rate is then independent of stress energy and only dependent on the stress number, or the number of stress events. Stress number then becomes this equipment agnostic performance parameter that governs the process, and the exact correlation between particle size and stress number is then dependent on the API breakage properties and could be teased out by inclusion of material parameters like the Young's modulus. So that was Some overview of the stress model. I'm going to talk about other types of models now. So the first order breakage rate is another good one, and it's described by this equation over here. It's commonly used to describe first order processes of any type, even chemical reactions, for example. And the model contains three different parameters that require estimation based on a small scale DOE, some of which are linked to material properties and others are linked to the processing conditions. So in terms of the order of steps that you would need to take, you would need to conduct a small scale DOE, about 10 experiments at the half-liter scale, fit the experimental data to the model and estimate the parameters, and then scale up is achieved via using a scale up law that's analogous to those used in mixing processes, where you would keep certain ratios of the impeller speed and diameter constant. The appeal in this approach and in the stress number approach is that you can upscale based on a very small number of lab experiments, and the rest is based on calculations, and the upscaling is based on a simple law. You can then go into large-scale engineering batches with some knowledge of what process parameters to set. To enhance the predictive ability of this type of model even further would require correlation between those material-dependent parameters with the relevant material properties. It links back to what I mentioned earlier regarding the Young's modulus and its correlation to the grinding limit. We do have a parameter over here, for example, which is the medium particle size at time equals infinity. This is essentially the grinding limit. And so a priori knowledge of this would be highly powerful and would make the model even more predictive. For a simpler approach, rules of thumb can be used. If, for example, you're just changing your batch size whilst the mill size remains the same, then all you have to do is keep the effective residence time normalized for batch volume constant, and that would be sufficient. If you're upscaling the mill size, provided that you have geometric similarity across the two equipment, then by keeping the effective residence time, as well as either a stress energy or a stress number or both constant, then you're likely to get equivalent behavior. And whether you need both stress energy and stress number or both is dependent on your API breakage kinetics. This concludes my modeling section. So I'm now going to move on to my last topic, which is process monitoring and control strategies. So in producing long-acting injectables, one of the major challenges is that it requires sterile processing. And this puts a limit on the number of samples that we can take during any large-scale engineering, characterization, and commercial runs during the life cycle of the product. In turn, this limits the information that we can gather for process characterization and almost eliminates the possibility for active process steering. This, along with other challenges such as limited amounts of API during the early development stages, the potential for excipient variability, and long cycle times, essentially issues that are characteristic of most pharmaceutical processes. All of this gets in the way of process monitoring and control. But where we would like to be is in a position where we can gather maximal process knowledge and understanding from every single experiment, have the option for in-process control or to actively steer the process if necessary, and reduce the long cycle times as much as possible by automating analysis. So this was our motivation for introducing PAT both in development and manufacturing. And I'll go into the specific types of tools that are available right now. But before that, I'm going to talk about control strategies for commercial production. So the type of control strategy will depend on your process and mostly on the batch-to-batch variability that's characteristic for the product. If, for example, you're operating on the plateau of a milling curve, most of the time, milling profiles tend to converge when you're operating here close to the grinding limit. And so you can opt for a fixed milling time because your process is very reproducible. This is what we would call a golden batch. In the event that the batch-to-batch variability is too high, then you would need to actively steer your process, either with offline sampling or with an inline PAT tool. There is also an option to have a combination approach where you can combine an in-process control sample or a number of them with an in-process control model in order to make predictions for the milling endpoint. This takes me nicely to my next slide, which shows the power of inline monitoring tools for both development and manufacturing purposes. So for microsuspensions, microscopy tools are currently leading the way in this area, and they can extract one-dimensional or two-dimensional information directly from an image. And the beauty of this is that it's not impacted by artifacts that are associated with the velocity of the particle traveling within um, the mixing vessel or in the piping, depending on where you integrate the tool, the viscosity of the media, the particle morphology, and those are issues that are commonly seen with other laser diffraction-based inline monitoring tools. So such a tool will output information such as particle count, a chord length distribution, looks a bit like this, and you would obtain it real time. So you can see the evolution of the particle size in real time, as well as a turbidity value. And this is very good for profiling of the entire curve and usually trends very well with the particle size. Regardless of the PAT tools that you use, inline measurements will present challenges such as the presence of air bubbles. And as we're working on high intensity and high agitation systems, depending on where you position the PAT tool, you may observe gas bubbles, and this would interfere with the measurements of the API. You can eliminate the effects of air bubbles either by using algorithms that discriminate according to the morphology, or alternatively by clever positioning of the PAT tool. And there are certain tricks and design elements that could be embedded and avoid the entrapment of air bubbles where the probe is located. The existence of multi-components in one system is another issue, especially if there's a difference in the backscattering intensity of the two material. If you have an API that backscatters more than the excipients and you're interested in detecting the API, then this works in your favor. Other issues could include low probability large particles, sample representation where flow cell design and positioning of the PAT tool is extremely important. But all of these issues can be fixed either by proper integration or through the use of algorithms. The only real limiter for in-process microscopy is its lack of ability to pick up submicron particles, and it's demonstrated in this image shown by the cutoff at 1 micron over here. Given this gap for inline tools that can measure nanoparticles in suspension, we began pulling together a consortium over a year ago in order to tackle this issue. And earlier this year, we obtained funding for the Pact for Nano project, which includes quite a fantastic range of partners who are technology providers and equipment manufacturers, research and academic institutes, as well as other industries who, like Janssen, have interest in developing and having access to performant real-time particle size measurement tools in the nano space. So to bring things to a close, I spoke about a range of different technologies that can produce micro and nano suspensions, where stirred media milling is still the predominant technique. But there's quite a lot of innovation happening in this space, in particular with regards to bottom-up processing. There is a need to provide a more clear decision tree for technology selection. So given all the different constraints that we have, both from a biopharmaceutics as well as a business perspective, we need to have a more systematic selection process that would help ensure we select the right technology from the early development stages. I've tried to show with a few examples the impact of material properties on the processability of a compound, as well as the impact of the process itself on the product quality attributes. And although we focus on particle size, I try to show that there are other attributes that in some cases could negatively impact the product in top-down milling. In terms of process modeling, there are a number of theories that can be applied, and the stress model is most of the time sufficient, but requires investigation for each individual system in order to identify the controlling breakage mechanism. How translatable the models are across the different technologies that we use across product development, so all the way from screening to manufacturing, this still remains a question, but would be of very high value. And finally, I showed microscopy-based tools that are successful and leading the way in real-time monitoring of microsuspensions, but we're filling the gap that exists in the nanospace with the development and deployment of new tools. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening and for taking the time out to attend this workshop. And I look forward to the discussions that we'll have after the presentation as well as in the breakouts later on.